I'm Karima Brown. It's Sunday and it's time for The Fix. First up, the South African Communist Party's first Deputy Secretary, Solly Mapaila, explains why they are still settling for a junior role in an unreconfigured tripartite alliance. Then we examine the government's toward a 25-year review, which gives an account of the policies and governance choices in the last 25 years under democracy. And as is custom, we take a look at what's made headlines in the weekend newspapers and why. The Fix starts now. Welcome to this edition of The Fix, where every Sunday we hold the decision makers to account. We'll tell you why it matters, how it affects you, and why you should care. Now, towards a 25-year review is a candid account of the effectiveness of government policy and its challenges and failures since the advent of democratic South Africa in 1994. It was made public by President Cyril Ramaphosa recently and subjected to public debate. Joining me now to unpack this discussion and this document is Mr. Rudy Dix from the Presidency, as well as Thulani Masilela, both from the Department of Monitoring and Evaluation, also located in the Presidency. Thulani, thank you so much for joining us. You and I will catch up with our conversation whilst your colleague Rudy Dix take a seat. This is quite a hefty document, and of course it's a very honest reflection in many ways of the policy decisions that government has taken, but most importantly, whether they were actually implemented. Now, for everybody watching, the most important thing is the economy. It is the one thing that we have been looking at, and it's the one thing that we've been struggling at. What are the key findings of your discussions and evaluation of economic policy over the last 25 years in South Africa's democracy, Thulani?
Thank you very much, Karima, and thanks for the invitation. Now, what the 25-year review shows, first of all, is that the democratic government inherited a flawed economy. I think we need to start from there. The apartheid debt was huge and it was unsustainable. The economy was really in tatters. Quite a number of economic policies were implemented with varying degrees of success, largely also because of the international and global phenomena. Our findings include both positives and areas where much better could have been done.
Absolutely. Let me bring you in, Rudy Dix. I see you are seated. The magic of television. Thank you so much for joining us. Now, before you went into the state, you also have a history in trade union background. Now, there's always been a contestation around economic policy. That contestation remains with us today. When you reflect on what we've done from, Nelson Mandela saying nationalization is not an option, to what we have today, which is not, we're not quite sure what it is that we have. All we know is that our economy is stagnant, it's not growing, we've got 10 million people unemployed. Reflecting on those years, are we doing the same thing, expecting different results? And is it time to make a radical break with what we're putting on the table in terms of economic development and policy?
Absolutely. I think that last words of yours is exactly what we need. This 25-year review reflects that. Reflects that we can't do the same thing. We're not going to grow, we're not going to deal with inequality, we're not going to deal with investment or any other forms of economic opportunities if we don't fundamentally and radically, because it requires a radical shift in the way we think. So we can't continue doing the same thing. In a sense, what we've done is inherited an economy from apartheid and, hoped that through the democracy, through the kind of constitutional reforms, that we can continue in the same way. But it does require for us to think very differently about a whole different sets of things, like industrial policy, for instance, like, for example, how we deal better around distribution,
small state-owned companies,
small business, and the fact that we don't have, the size of small businesses in the economy is relatively low compared to other parts of the world. Fundamentally, a whole different set of things. The way we see employment, for example, also.
Okay, let's take it apart in terms of economic issues, right? So let's talk about the importance of growth, because obviously without growth, none of the other things are possible. But we've had periods, Thulani, where we've had growth, but we haven't had the necessary knock-on effects Professor Benturak, who departed from us this week, sadly, often argued that that trickle-down effect simply didn't happen. Our economy remains highly concentrated, both in the public and the private sector. In the recommendations of the 25-year review, what is it that you are suggesting that we do different structurally in terms of that highly concentrated way in which our economy is structured?
So there are about 3 or 4 key issues. First of all, we identified the fact that our economy has been very dependent on the hardcore minerals, which have really reached by sell-by date. We are no longer the first or the second.
So you are disagreeing with Mr. Mantashe, who says that the mining industry is a sunset, or rather sunrise industry instead of a sunset industry.
No, don't put me against my minister.
Well, that's my job, isn't it?
You know, I'm sure it is. No, what I'm saying is we used to be number 1 or number 2 in the world. We're now number 8.
And that's just reality.
That's just reality, which we can't avoid from, you know. And I'm sure the minister also departs from that point of view. That means we can no longer depend on the hardcore minerals the way we used to 60 years ago, 30 years ago. We need to use our competitive edge, for instance, in manufacturing, as Rudy was saying. The state also has to intervene in the economy. It's an unpopular statement, but it's reality.
Okay, just on that question, the state having to intervene. Now, we've got a terrible situation in South Africa. When I spoke with Zwelinzima Vavi the last time, he admitted that both the state sector and the private sector have terrible track records, both in terms of efficient managing as well as corruption and highly concentrated ways of doing things. Now, how do we get to a situation where the economy is managed efficiently, both from a private and public sector point of view, Rudy? What is it that managers in the state need to do differently? What is it that CEOs in companies need to do differently so that the South African economy isn't tied to its legacy? You know, and how do we move from a mineral industrial complex to, let's say, manufacturing, when manufacturing actually requires deep pockets? Are our financial institutions prepared to put the money where their mouths are?
But I think Tulani is right just around. I mean, it's not about putting us against the minister. I think all acknowledged we don't have the ore body that we had 50 years ago. We don't have gold. We don't have the platinum that is there.
Yes.
So it requires for us, in the same way, for example, that the Saudis are having a discussion about, you know, shifting from oil as the primary source of economic growth for them. It just requires for us to think very differently around diversification. So it's not only manufacturing, Karima. It's tourism, for instance. Right, so tourism is important. We have 3,000 kilometers of coastline. We're a very attractive tourist destination. How do we make that very different?
What do you do, Rudy, with tourism when a tourist goes up Table Mountain in the cable car and gets stuck as a result of the generator going through a power surge because we're going through load shedding? So one accepts that one must diversify, but there are huge impediments to getting these things off. I mean, that story was literally in the papers this week.
Not only that, I mean, it also puts workers who, for example, work in mining shafts at risk. Because when Eskom goes to mining houses and say, we're going to curtail you, it literally means that there's such a significant risk to those who are working in hazardous work environments. I fundamentally agree with you. I mean, I think if we don't fix the SOE, and particularly Eskom, we can't grow our economy. Energy is primary towards our growth. If we cannot do that, there's nothing we can do to be able to talk about diversification or any other particular sectors. I think we need to have you know, much more serious intervention. The announcements that the President had made during the course of the week was important. The announcements by Eskom that there's no leave that's going to be given to senior executives and to you know, senior officials that are required to do maintenance. We need to have a serious maintenance regime in place. We need to ensure that we deal with those kind of particular problems to fix that, because you can't grow if you don't have a stable energy supply.
I agree with you wholeheartedly, and we're speaking with Hilary Joffrey, who's an expert on Eskom, former spokesman also. So she's the associate editor of Business Times. We're going to be speaking to her a bit later. But let's come to this question of diversifying the economy. We've now spoken about things like tourism, manufacturing. What about agro-processing? What about agriculture? And more importantly, how does the mechanization of agriculture impact on the ability of that sector to absorb large you know, numbers of unskilled workers and people who are very badly protected under current labor laws?
No, you're absolutely spot on about that one. We have said that agriculture is an area we should be focusing on. And one of the things we need to do is to encourage young people to get involved in agriculture. In fact, we are calling for the expansion of our post-school education sector to focus more on agriculture. Secondly,
but how do you do that if you've closed down all your technical schools? I mean, in a place like Alice, which has the world-famous university that has given us liberation leader after liberation leader, the technical school is standing empty. It's vandalized. There's nothing happening there. I mean, it's one thing to say this, and then when you look at the education budget, you don't see the correlation in terms of planning between what the economy needs and what the education department needs to push out to Lani.
So remember that 1 5-year review is also about reviewing and revisiting and revising some of the decisions that were made in the past, which are currently not working, are currently not giving us the results we desire. So the college we have identified, together with the others we have identified, will be repositioned to strengthen and revitalize agriculture. Agro-processing is very central to our processes, and about 32 districts that have been identified, particularly for this. We see the fourth industrial revolution playing a major role in agriculture in different ways. So you're right as well about using modern technology to modernize agriculture. So yeah.
I don't want to make fun of the state.
Can I just say one more thing about
I don't want to make fun of the state when you turn out these words like fourth industrial revolution when we can't even get parts of the second and third stages of the industrial revolution right. When the cable cars are getting stuck because our generators aren't working. Aren't we creating unnecessary policy expectations that are simply not cognizant with our reality? I want to get to the capacity of the state next, because obviously a lot of this depends also on what capacity you have in the state. And I mean, the report is very candid about the lack of skills in the state. But make your point first, and then let's come back to trying to leapfrog to the fourth industrial revolution, but having very severe constraints in the state.
My point about education is that, I mean, I think what we've come to realize, particularly at vocational training, right, is that it requires a strong partnership. We need to go back to a system where I think there's a partnership between the private sector. So the private sector talks about the skills requirements for the industry. And therefore you need to then say, how do we design the theoretical components to be able to make what is required for the industry? And I think that kind of conversation is quite an important conversation that this book reflects on. And talks about how we make technical vocational education and training institutions, particularly where they've collapsed or where they've gone backward, right? Developing those kind of strong partnerships with the industry.
How do we do that with a country that is literally living above its means? We don't have the money we require to deliver basic services. And when the finance minister says this, we call him irrational, we call him a maverick, and many other things. I don't necessarily agree with everything that he has to say, but we cannot get away from the fact that we are living above our means.
There's lots of money in the CETA system, Taxes are being paid.
Why don't you deal with the corruption? So perhaps some of that money can be unlocked.
No, well, that money can be unlocked. I think there's quite a bit of money that is in there that's used for, for non-accredited training, for example.
Give me a ballpark figure, Rudy. What can we release from the CETAs that can go to TVETs, for example, that can go to job training after people have done the skills training, and they can actually get real job experience? What kind of money are we talking about here?
Sure, you're putting me on the spot. I won't be able to give you kind of like direct answer, but I think there is money that one could release and have a particular... Look, the main thing about the TVET component is not so much the money. It's this experiential component. It's the component where young people are unable to get the N6 because they can't finish the qualification.
Exactly.
Because they don't have the experiential component, doing the work in service. Right?
Yeah.
And I think
and
that's
for that you need the private sector.
That you need the private sector, but you also need a component of funding for that. Right? So I mean, you need to incentivize it.
Don't we have that already? I mean, don't we have... I remember when the financial crisis hit, we set up a trust looking at companies that are in distress, etc. And one of the things that they needed to do before they retrenched people was to retrain them. And they would actually get assistance from the state. But when Kusatu actually did the tallying up, it showed that very few companies actually took the state up to Lani on this offer and instead filed for bankruptcy. Why would a company opt to go for bankruptcy rather than get state assistance to retrain workers and to retain jobs? Shouldn't the private sector also have a different approach to their understanding of sustainable business?
You've led us nicely to the recommendation in the 25-year review about the need for a national compact around the economy. where key role players, including the private sector, government, academia, and anybody who benefits from the skills that the country seeks to produce, also contributes. One, to the skills development process, as Rudy was saying, in support in addition to what the CITAS will be doing, but also because they themselves in the short and medium term tend to benefit. So it becomes unfortunate, as you've indicated, when a company withdraws from an incentive scheme that the state is providing. The social compact, or the national compact around the economy, seeks to revive that, to reignite it. And we've seen the president leading on this, with the job summit, with the investment summit, it all in that spirit.
But the point is, Rudy, everyone is saying we need to be beyond summits. We need to be beyond agreements. And these social compacts need to be bottom-up compacts. They can't just be signed by important people in a big hall where everyone feels happy with themselves. But when we walk out, we don't really want to understand that perhaps the reason why we have load shedding is because we decided to give free tertiary education even to middle-class children who can actually and should, in my view, pay for their education.
Okay, that's your view, right? But I think it's...
But isn't that the trade-off? Isn't the fact that South
must
Africans actually decide that in some instances the reason why teachers can't get pay increases is because classrooms have to be built, or the reasons why you can't do maintenance at Eskom is because the money is actually going to fund people who ordinarily would simply not have had access to education, or those who can have access to education, we're giving it to them for free anyway because it's a lovely political slogan to have before elections.
Absolutely. I think it was, I mean, you're right about that, right? There are always trade-offs in the budget, right? So if you make a particular choice to say you're going to spend on something, you have to forgo other things because you only have a limited resources. It makes it even more constraining for us because we're not growing at the rate. So you could easily borrow more money, you could easily ask for more money elsewhere, but it's on the basis that you can grow. With our economy in a slump, not being able to grow, it makes it even more difficult to do that. But you're right, it is those trade-offs. So if we take a choice around we're going to invest on a particular area of what we think is important for us, whether it's social, economic, it means that something else would have to do. And I think that's the important thing. The Eskom thing is a different thing altogether, because there's excessive cost that has been, for example, on Medupi and Kusile on the new build program, right? I mean, initially planned for 50 billion rand, Medupi cost 150 billion rand.
But now here's the thing. In the letter that the president sends out every Monday morning, like last week's letter, he was singing Medupi's praises and saying he's never seen such a fantastic, plant, and it's hard for people to actually believe, but it's apparently the 4th largest in the world. The damn thing isn't working, Rudy. So why should we be impressed with the fact that it's the 4th largest in the world? It's not giving me electricity when I switch on my light.
There are faults, right? I mean, I think the president admits that there's design faults in the way that we've built the... We have to admit that, right? Design faults, they are going to take a bit of money to be able to fix that, but it can increase its capacity. It is very sophisticated. It is quite...
so sophisticated that no one there understands what it is that it means to do. I mean, we have a headline in today's Sunday Independent. Do you, for example, think that Brian Molefe should go back to Eskom?
Well, I think that's for the Eskom board and the shareholder to decide. Right now, the shareholder government has taken a decision that Andre de Ruyter is the CEO.
I can't see Minister Mantashe, who's the energy minister. I can't see Minister Gordon, who's the public enterprises minister, even talking about that. But here's the thing, Tulani. We have people like Matela Koko. We have people like Brian Molefe speaking, being interviewed on public platforms, offering advice after ruining one of Africa's top institutions. Does the review explain the extent to which the rot that happened under the Zuma years actually impacted our ability to, accelerate and to provide basic services? Because the thing that I find very disturbing about this 25-year review, it doesn't talk about state capture, it doesn't address it. It talks about corruption, but it doesn't talk about the scale which the academics described akin to a coup. Why is it that this document refuses to acknowledge state capture for what it actually is?
So there are various sections in the document that deal with corruption, and are very explicit and very frank and forthright and honest that corruption has contributed significantly towards destroying the potential of this country. That's number one. Secondly, you'll find in the foreword by Minister Mthembu that he does make reference to the commission headed by Deputy Chief Justice Zondo, and that we look forward to the completion of the work and the implementation of the recommendations thereof. It was not possible to preempt the outcome of the commission at the time of writing the 25-year review. It was not possible to predict. What the 25-year review could do was to express its support for the work that's currently happening, being led by Justice Zondo. And we hope that all those who are culpable will be brought to book through that process, and that the country will be able to recoup its resources that have been misdirected. That is the first thing. The second thing is that on the chapter that deals with crime, there's also a reference to the scourge of corruption. It also indicates that we also have high crime levels. One, because of inequality, but because people see this corruption flourishing. And then, people become so unhappy, and legitimately so. So the 25-year review is very vocal on corruption being rooted out from our country. But as for the specific commission, I think we'll have to wait.
Absolutely. It's something to which we return. But let's go to the heart of the economy again, Rudy. If we are to restructure the economy, right, and we're saying that we need to lessen our dependence on the commodity sector, which, of course, globally was also hit. I mean, I'm always struck when the 10-year review came out with Joel Nesitenji still being the policy czar in the government. He spoke about the growth of Rustenburg, for example, projecting that Rustenburg would be a leading African city because of the fact that it sat atop this heap of platinum. And we could, of course, know if we turn the taps open in Rustenburg now, the water is black. So that scenario went down the drain. So the projections that one often has as a result of what you think you can leverage changes because of the way in which your state develops, the way your economy develops. What is it that the recommendations put forward that needs to happen for our economy to take a radically different turn and do things differently?
It does. It makes quite a number of recommendations. First, it talks through substantially trying to think through industrial policy in a very different way. So traditionally how we see industrial policy is in a way that we kind of like captured in the 60s.
Yeah, it's protectionist, it's
very protectionist,
yes,
very productive sector focused, right? So it's important productive sectors are important, right? So manufacturing is going to be very, very important because it does create, and we've been very successful in two manufacturing sectors, I must say. Those two manufacturing sectors is that we've been able to turn around clothing and textile, for instance, where it's beginning to grow. We now manufacture 70 million pairs of shoes, right, where previously we used to probably had about 20 million, right? Autos has been absolutely our successful sector, very supportive from the state, has 110,000 people working in the sector. We are the largest car manufacturer on the continent. Absolutely.
But where's our own car, Rudy?
I don't think
How far are we off from that?
I think the discussion around auto and owning our own car is way past, Karima. I don't think we're looking at manufacturing our own car. Ours is about how we develop a competitive base and how we can support, for example, middle-class people and other workers to be able to get that. So we need to talk about what sort of support do we develop, right? But it's also quite critical that what we did with autos in 1994 was to say this is a primary export sector. We're going to export.
Prioritized as such and ring-fenced.
Absolutely. We said we're not going to do anything. We're not going to build a new car. We had discussions around that. We talked about, transformation. But the key focus of the auto program when the ruling party took over in 1994 was primarily to say we are developing an export sector, right? And significantly so, exports earned on auto in 17-18 financial years about 180 billion rand. The auto, for example, auto sector, together with, again, bottom-up social compacting between government, the unions, and the auto sector, have set a target for 2035 that talks about, capturing 1% of the global market. That's 1.2 million units a year. Doubling employment in the value chains. So, 110,000, 220,000 in 10 years. And increasing the supply development component, right? Local supply content from currently 38% to 60%. So they've set 3 clear targets. This is what we want. And they're working on it. So I think that's the kind of approach that you require, where social compacting in those particular sectors. Services is another growth sector. Agriculture first. Let's talk about agriculture. I think Tulani has spoken about that.
Okay, hold your thoughts on agriculture. We've got to pay the bills. On the other side of this, we will continue our conversation on the 25-year review and look at whether the policy decisions that we've taken since the advent of democracy has actually helped bring about a democratic change for South Africans. Don't go away.